armed majorly with homemade weapons, spears and machetes. About 20,000 men and women, mostly from the Kikuyu ethnic group in Kenya, waged an intense guerrilla war against the British and their African loyalists in the 1950s. Their demand was land and freedom. The Mau Mau's failed rebellion indirectly succeeded in liberating Kenya from colonial rule, but their victory was claimed by cabal who alienated the actual fighters. In this edition on History Media, we revisit the story of the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya and why the fighters continue to suffer neglect after years of independence from colonial rule. Please come with me. The East African country of Kenya was settled by Europeans at the start of the 20th century. The settlers concentrated in the fertile highlands, mainly farming tea, coffee, and sisal. When Kenya became a crown colony of the British government in 1920, the settlers were able to introduce a number of restrictions on land ownership and agricultural practices in order to protect their own interests and push the Kikuyu out. The Kikuyu were the original owners of the land. Forced from their traditional tribal areas, many disaffected Kikuyu migrated to the capital Nairobi. The violent armed rebellion of the Mau Mau was the culminating response to colonial rule. Right from the beginning, land was the primary British interest in Kenya. The area had some of the richest agricultural soils in the world, mostly in districts where the elevation and climate were suitable for Europeans to reside permanently. Opposition to British imperialism had existed from the start of British occupation. But none of the armed uprisings during the beginning of British colonialism in Kenya were successful. Until the mid-1930s, the two primary complaints were low wages for native Kenyans and the requirement to carry an identity document known as a kipande. From the early 1930s, however, two other demands began to come into prominence: effective and elected African political representatives and land. The British response to this demand for agrarian reforms came in the early 1930s when they set up the Qatar Land Commission. The commission reported in 1934, but its conclusions, recommendations and concessions to Kenyans were so conservative that any chance of a peaceful resolution to native Kenyan land hunger was ended. Through a series of dispositions, the government seized about 28,000 square kilometers of land, most of it in the fertile hilly region of Central and Rift Valley provinces. The area was later known as the White Highlands due to the exclusively European-owned farmlands in that area. By the 1930s, and for the Kikuyu in particular, land had become the #1 grievances concerning colonial rule. In addition, the colonial government and white farmers also wanted cheap labor, which for a period the government acquired from native Kenyans through force. Confiscating the land also helped to create a pool of wage laborers. So, how was this wage labor categorized? Native Kenyan laborers were of three categories: the squatter, the contract, or the casual labor. By the end of World War I, squatters had become well established on European farms and plantations in Kenya. The Kikuyu squatters formed the majority of laborers on settler plantations. The Native Laborers Ordinance of 1939 finally eliminated squatters' remaining tenancy rights and permitted settlers to demand 270 days' labor from any squatter on their land. After World War II, the situation for squatters deteriorated rapidly, a situation the squatters resisted fearlessly. But was it this situation that heralded the birth of the Mau Mau rebellion? Well, the origin of the term Mau Mau is uncertain. While the British gave the name Mau Mau, members of the group preferred to be known by their military title, Kenya Land and Freedom Army, the KLFA. Some researchers claim that Mau Mau was an anagram of Uma Uma, which means get out, and was a military code word based on a secret language game that the Kikuyu boys used to play at the time of their circumcision. Interestingly, the British did not assign any meaning to the term. But according to the Akamba people, the name Mau Mau came from the Ma Umau, meaning our grandfathers. The term was first used during the pastoralist revolt against the stocking in 1938 and was led by Mwende Mbingu. During the revolt, he urged the colonies to leave Kenya for his people, the Akamba, to live freely like the time of our grandfathers. But according to MJ Karaoke, a member of Mau Mau who was detained during the conflict, the British preferred to use the term Mau Mau instead of KLFA in order to deny the Mau Mau rebellion international legitimacy. Meanwhile, other origins and meanings have been ascribed to the name by different people. However, before we look at how the colonial government reacted to the threat of the Mau Mau, let us first explain how the group waged a warfare against the authorities. Mau Mau were the militant wing of a growing demand for political representation and freedom in Kenya. The first attempt to form a nationwide political organization began on the 1st of October 1944 and was called the Kenyan African Study Union, KASU. Harry Tuku was the first chairman, but he soon resigned. However, in 1946, KASU changed its name to the Kenyan African Union, KAU. Many of the organizers of the union were disgruntled ex-soldiers who fought for the British in Ceylon, Somalia and Burma during the Second World War. Unfortunately, the KAU failed to achieve any meaningful reforms. But this failure helped to shift the initiative to a younger and more militant native Kenyan population. Around 1943, residents of Olengurion settlement radicalized the traditional practice of oath-taking and also extended the practice to women and children. By the mid-1950s, 90% of Kikuyu, Embu, and Meru had all taken the oath. On the 3rd of October 1952, Mau Mau claimed their first European victim when they stabbed a woman to death near her home in Tika. 6 days later, on October 9th, a senior chief, Waruhiu, was shot dead in broad daylight in his car, which was an important blow against the colonial government. Waruhiu had been one of the strongest supporters of the British presence in Kenya. His assassination gave Evelyn Baring the final impetus to request permission from the colonial office to declare a state of emergency. The Mau Mau's subsequent guerrilla attacks were well planned and organized, and since they lacked heavy weapons, they operated mostly at night. They were fast and brutal. But how did the colonial authorities react to the threat of Mau Mau? Well, generally, Mau Mau was viewed as a savage, violent and depraved tribal cult that expressed unrestrained emotion rather than reason. They were described as a perverted tribalism that sought to take the Kikuyu people back to the bad old days before British rule. But by the mid-1960s, this view was being challenged by memoirs of former members. They portrayed Mau Mau as an essential component of African nationalism in Kenya. In the summer of 1952, Philip Mitchell retired as governor of Kenya, having turned a blind eye to the increasing activity of Mau Mau. Through the summer of 1952, however, Colonial Secretary Oliver Littleton, who resided in London, was receiving steady flow of reports from acting governor Henry Porter about the escalating seriousness of Mau Mau violence. But it was not until the latter part of 1953 that British politicians began to accept the seriousness of the rebellion. At first, they discounted the Mau Mau rebellion, citing their own military superiority. On the 30th of September 1952, Evelyn Baring arrived in Kenya to permanently take over from Porter. Baring was unaware of the turbulent situation he was stepping into and was not prepared for it. But confronted with the challenge, he formulated two strategies to defeat the rebellion. During the first stage, the British declared a state of emergency on the 20th of October 1952 and was followed the next day by Operation Jockstock on the 21st of October 1952. This operation had suspected Mau Mau members, including Jomo Kenyatta and 6 others, arrested, tried in a show trial, and detained. But just caught, not achieve any desired outcome, as real militants such as Dedan Kimathi and Stanley Matenge fled to the forest. The second stage had three phases. First, Operation Anvil. This operation involved the mass arrest and confinement of thousands of suspected Mau Mau members and sympathizers in Nairobi. The second phase, the Swinnerton Plan, adopted the creation of major agrarian reforms. The goal of the reform was to create family holdings that were large enough to keep families self-sufficient in food. And the final phase was the villagization program for more than 1 million rural Kikuyu. The program began in June 1954, and within 18 months, 1,050,899 Kikuyu in the reserves were resettled in some 230,000 huts. However, different coercive measures such as a communal labor, collective fines, and further confiscation of land and property were also initiated to punish and break Mau Mau support. When the mass deportation of Kikuyu to the reserves began in 1953, Barron and Eskins ordered all Mau Mau suspects to be screened. Thomas Axwit, the official tasked with designing the British detention and rehabilitation program during the summer and autumn of 1953, termed his system the pipeline. The pipeline operated a white-grey-black classification system. The whites were cooperative detainees and were repatriated back to the reserves. The greys had been outed but were reasonably compliant and were moved down the pipeline to works camps in their local district before release. And the blacks were the hardcore of Mau Mau and were moved up the pipeline to special detention camps. Detainees were screened and rescreened for confession and intelligence, then reclassified accordingly. Once in camp, talking was forbidden outside the detainees' accommodation hut. On the 18th of January 1955, the Governor General of Kenya, Evelyn Baring, offered an amnesty to Mau Mau activists. The offer was that Mau Mau members would not face prosecution for previous offenses but may still be detained. On the 10th of June 1955, with no response forthcoming, the offer of amnesty to the Mau Mau was revoked. But in June 1956, a program of land reform increased the land holdings of the Kikuyu. This was coupled with a relaxation of the ban on native Kenyans growing some primary cash crops. By 1956, the British had granted direct election of native Kenyan members of Legislative Assembly, followed shortly by an increase in the number of local seats to 14. A parliamentary conference in January 1966 indicated that the British would accept one person, one vote majority rule. So, how many people are believed to have died from the violence of Mau Mau? The number of deaths resulting from the British emergency in Kenya is still a subject of contention to this day. While some historians put it at about 25,000 deaths, others estimated about 50,000. The most exaggerated and widely disputed account put the number of deaths at between 130,000 to 300,000. The Mau Mau killed around 1,800 African loyalists along with 32 Europeans and 26 Asian civilians. The rebels also killed about 200 colonial security forces during the fighting. But one unfortunate thing is that after independence, the Mau Mau are still landless. When Kenya gained independence in December 1963, Jomo Kenyatta emerged as the country's first president just 2 years after he was released from prison. If the Mau Mau believed that their supposed leader would right the wrongs of colonial rule, they were wrong. Instead, at every moment, Kenyatta attempted to marginalize those who had fought and were detained during the war. Finally, Mau Mau was seen as a threat to the new political order and remained banned till 2003. Rather than oversee a just redistribution of land and compensation, Kenyatta announced that land were only available for sale. Nothing is free, he said. Independence for the Mau Mau was no different than being moved from one prison to another prison. On the 6th of June 2013, the Foreign Secretary William Hague told Parliament that the United Kingdom government had reached a settlement with the claimant. He said it included payment of a settlement sum in respect of 5,228 claimants, as well as a gross cost sum to the total value of £19.9 million. The government will also support the construction of a memorial in Nairobi to the victims of torture and ill treatment during the colonial era. For more African history stories, please click the video displayed here. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Hisbul Media, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you very much for watching. Peace.